Virginia Tech University and had been enslaved by the Preston family since they came through the transatlantic slave trade. So they had always been with the same family. Now, there are sections of the fractions that had been sold away, as was very common during enslavement, but a large section of the fractions actually stayed enslaved within the same family for multiple generations. And so with finding out more information, we figured out that even the fractions that had been sold away and dispersed about, they knew to come back to Virginia, and that the family was actually close until about 1910. And that's about the same period that my grandmother's mother had ended up in an orphanage. So this is my great-grandmother. This is my grandmother's mother. So this is the last matriarch for our line who had the last name Fraction. Her name is Isabel Fraction. And so it would have been Isabel's grandfather who was the last enslaved individual within our family. And so when you look at that, the idea of slavery becomes very close rather than a distant history. I knew Isabel. I remember Isabel. Isabel passed away when I was about 5 years old, but I do remember Isabel. So the idea that I had knew the granddaughter of an enslaved individual makes you think, it's really not that far away. And so I started off with the book being something that was really just a list of facts. And then the story really came together because there was a lot of detail about the fractions in the Virginia Special Collections, in the state of Virginia archives, and in the National Archives, because they fought for the Union Army in the Civil War. After the Civil War, they came back to Blacksburg. They tried to build their home on the land down there where Virginia Tech today, and they kind of was terrorized and prevented from doing that. But they really considered that place home. So this is the closest picture we have right now of Thomas Fraction, which was the last enslaved person in my family line. And as you see, what he ends up living is in Salem, Virginia. So after he was terrorized and ran away from Montgomery County and Blacksburg, the furthest he went to Salem. A lot of us are in Baltimore, Maryland right now, because after Thomas and his family went to Salem, upon his death, the state and a lot of businesses started really terrorizing his wife and taking his land because he managed to get a plot of land in Salem. And at that point, his wife, whose name was Isabella, was like, no, I'm not dealing with this. So she left and came to Baltimore because their oldest daughter had married a man, and he came to Baltimore for work, and she just followed her up here. And that's how we got to Baltimore today. So we're finding more information about the fractions. We started looking at census records because what we learned was that the name Fraction was very odd. They were not a family that had took on the surname of their enslaver, which was very common for enslaved individuals. In fact, they end up with their surname probably around the second or third generation of the transatlantic slave trade. So there's a couple of theories about how they got the last name Fraction. One theory is that it was a reminder they was 3/4 a person or a fraction of a man. Another theory is that when we go by the linguistics of the time, fraction wasn't just about math. It was a variation on the word fractious, which means likely to quarrel, likely to fight, or troublesome, which could be a label for enslaved individuals who were likely to quarrel, likely to fight, or somebody that they thought needed to be watched very closely. The other important thing about census records is fractions is we found that it made them very easy to find in history and locate. Even when we locate the descendants today, we have not come across a person with the last name Fraction or whose family's last name Fraction that we can't trace back to Blacksburg, Virginia, and the Smithfield and Solitude plantations. So the last name is very important. So this is Smithfield. You guys are probably familiar with it. It is a house museum there that's within the campus of Virginia Tech, even though it's an acreage that's kind of set apart and it's managed by the Smithfield-Preston Foundation. And you're free to visit. They've been doing a lot of improvements on their narrative for their tours, so you can learn more about the enslaved community and the indigenous story for the area. So this is something that's in Virginia Tech Special Collections. So this is one of the first times that we see an enslaved individual with the last name Fraction. So this would be John Fraction. He's 40 years old at the time. He has a monetary value of $400. Below him on the inventory list is the rest of his family, all the way down here to when you get to age 2. You can't see his name, but that's Thomas Fraction. That's the signature that we saw starting off at the beginning of this. What's interesting about an inventory is that when you flip the page, you go from the list of the enslaved individuals until you also see things like furniture, cattle, silverware, things like that, to really show that they were property, and that's how they were viewed at the time. And so we're doing the research for the book. We went through so many records. We went through newspaper articles, we went through census records, we went through the National Archives, we went through military records, we went through paperwork of the Prestons, we went through so much to find information. And so we really started to piece them back together. And so the first thing we did was piece together the 2 lines of the 2 brothers. So when you read the book, one of the most interesting people within the family is the 2 brothers, Thomas and Othello Fraction. So they are never without each other in all historical documentation and records. They're really close brothers. So the first thing that we did was try to find the descendants of Othello so we can put them back together. So this would be Othello's daughter right here. He didn't have children until later on. He didn't have his first child until he was almost 50 years old. So his daughter, is very, very close to us in terms of generation and closeness of history. It turns out when we look at the census records that these 2 had actually known each other for a period of time, and they ended up in an orphanage at the same time. So when my grandmother said that her mother, which is Isabel here, ended up in an orphanage, no one knew that she was in an orphanage at the same time as her cousin. And so when we pieced that back together, we brought the 2 lines back and says that it looks like this family fractured around 1910. So as we find other descendants, what we like to do is we like to take them down to Blacksburg, tell them the story and that's within the book, and let them experience it for themselves. And so this is one of the groups that we took down, and we took a picture with Virginia Fraction Capers, and she is Thomas Fraction's older sister. She is buried in the Preston Family Cemetery on the Smithfield plot. So we're writing a story. How do you create human beings for a story of enslaved individuals? The goal of the book is to make them more than just enslaved individuals. We really want to focus on their humanity, their personalities, and their experience. And so I really had to explore what does that look like when a lot of documentation is limited to their condition. So one of the first things that we do is we watch the language that we're using. Okay, so a slave is an identity. But an enslaved is a condition. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to name them as individuals and as people. We'll name their condition. Thomas Fraction was an enslaved individual, but we won't say Thomas Fraction was a slave. And that's important because in a lot of transcripts and things written and said by Thomas himself, he would often push against the idea that he was a slave and that he had a master. In fact, in the Federal Freedmen's Bureau record, they asked him who his former master was, and he said that he had none. So we took that idea and we tried to figure out, outside of what Eurocentric presentations have showed us, so that slaves are being docile, they've been wiped clean of their memory and their culture. The minute that they got on the boat, they don't remember anything, they don't know anything, they're just clean slates to be remolded as slaves, as an identity, they're nothing else. So when you start digging into it and trying to personify them so that the story is really rich in culture, you start looking at some things. And so I found this article from January 16th, 1869, where they're describing the newly freed communities. And one of the things that I found very interesting was this statement here when it says, north of Salem, 2 good-sized towns have sprung up since the war, bearing the names of Africa and Liberia, which kind of hints to me that there was some awareness about their cultural and their background, and that, they were kind of a fusion of the two, and that regardless of the the ideal, the narrative that they were a blank slate and they didn't remember anything. It just seems like maybe they actually did, and they were trying to recognize, acknowledge, and honor that within their own freedom. So then you start looking at the history of slavery in general. So you talk about what you know. They came over, transatlantic slave trade, and slave ship. They were natives, and so you get the idea of they were tribal men on the west coast of Africa, and they were confused, and they were enslaved, and you know, they were no men, they were savages, you know, kind of languages that you hear throughout. But then there's this book from 1789 by a man named Olodo Kwano. He was an individual who was enslaved in England, and then he gained his freedom, and then he wrote down his story. And in his story, he talks about the area of West Africa that the fractions would have came from. And so you get an idea of where they came from and what they might have known and thought about as enslaved individuals based on this distant cousin of theirs. So in West Africa, they would have came from nations and tribes like Benin, Togo, Igbo, Yoruba, Oyo, and Bantu. Okay. So one of the things that he says is that part of Africa known by the name of Guinea, to which the trade for slaves is carried on, extends along the coast about 3,400 miles from the Senegal to Angola and includes a variety of kingdoms. Of these, the most considerable is the Kingdom of Benin, both as to extent and wealth, the richness and cultivation of the soil, the power of its kings, and the number and warlike disposition of the inhabitants. So it doesn't really sound like uncultured savages. So it's a culture there. And so I figured to be able to give my ancestors more than just bullet point fact plates in the story, let's figure out who they were based on this background and culture. Because the best way to really tell a story is to kind of look at their descendants now. I like to stay within my own literature and research. Right now, I'm working on a book chapter for a book that Virginia Tech is writing called Contested Spaces, where I'm going to talk about this a lot more. Is that the idea of African American, it's like an infusion, it's a new tribe of the African diaspora that is a combination of the experience of being descendants of the enslaved and descendants of the African West Coast. And so what does that look like? So I started looking at the different cultures of the time and started looking and seeing hints of the African Americans today. And so if we like to think about traditions now, it's very often we talk about traditions and things being passed down from generation to generation to generation. So we're going to take that same theory and idea in developing the individuals within this story and assume that what their descendants are doing now are things that they've learned from generation to generation and goes back to these individuals that were enslaved at Smithfield and Solitude, or what is today Virginia Tech. So one of the things he goes on to say is that this kingdom is divided into many provinces or districts, and one of the most remote and fertile of which called Igbo. I was born in the year 1745 in a charming, fruitful vale named Isaka. The distance of this province from the capital of Benin and the seacoast must be very considerable, for I had never heard of white men or Europeans, nor of the sea, and our subjugation to the king of Benin was little more than nominal, for every transaction of the government, as far as my slender observation extended, was conducted by the chiefs or elders of the place. The manners and government of a people who will have little commerce with other countries are generally very simple, and the history of what passes in one family or village may serve as a specimen of a nation. And so where he's coming from, history and word of mouth, or what we will often refer to as griot, is very important and very common. And so we start piecing together things in the African American community now that are very close or identical to West African culture, both then and now. One example, jumping the broom. So during a wedding, you may jump a broom. In West Africa, the brooms were used to either swipe over their head so you can ward away evil spirits and you can start the marriage healthy and wise and blessed. And then you would jump the broom. That's an infusion that came here and ended up in the African American community, where jumping the broom is starting a clean slate. And it's a symbolism of caring for and taking care of the new family that you're creating. Other things is hairstyles. And so this is a modern woman wearing what we would call mini braids or small twists or dreadlocks, which is very similar to the hairstyles that are practiced in West Africa. In hip hop and rap music, what generally idea within the urban communities, you will pour a drink out for the homies. You share a little bit when someone passes away and you meet at the person where they pass away, and you may serve or share the food or the liquid in order to recognize that that person was important to your life. West Africa, they call that libations. We also use the word libations within the English language to just talk about spirits or liquor. But it's a ceremonial thing in West Africa, libations, that looks very similar. So the more you find these similarities, you really start to question of whether or not the enslaved individuals had actually been wiped clean. Another example of hairstyles is the BANTU knots. This is a modern word with BANTU knots, and it was very common, and it's a hairstyle still in West Africa. BANTU knots is a good way for when you have big hair like this, and you have to moisturize it. You put like a deep conditioner in it, and then you wrap it up like that. Sometimes you can 2-strand twist it, or you can BANTU knot, and it really lets the moisture get into the strands of the hair, and it's an excellent hair tradition. But the fact that we still know that and we still do that kind of goes back to West Africa and possibly the transatlantic slave trade. So then one day I was thinking about, some religious ceremonies, and so I saw this video that I'll share with you. And I want you to pay attention to the dances, to the footwork, really, really the footwork in the arms, So when I saw this video, I said, wait a minute. When you grow up in an African-American, Black, Baptist, Episcopal, AME, all the different virgin churches, you recognize that right off the bat. We call that Holy Ghost or the praise break. So here's an example. It don't make no sense when there's water be on wood like this, and we ain't got nobody dancing on it. We don't believe us. We need to make some noise. People need to know that we're saved. They need to know that we love Jesus. We are the believers. We need about 3 people that don't mind giving God one more praise. Anybody want to help me raise God? Come on, 1, 2, 3. So this is also a religious ceremony. Same footwork, same armor. Same footwork, same armwork. So when you see things like this, you really start to say, wait a minute, wait. So you can really start to form them. So within the book, I'm not going to say you forget they were enslaved, because there's stories in the encompassing of the environment of slavery. But you get other things. You get them personalities. There's evidence that some of them were very sarcastic. Some of them were just straight to the point. Some of them were very talkative and long-winded. And so you have all of those personalities. We're finding the other descendants. We try to find some things that they have in common. So the fractions seem to have a lot of artists and a lot of musicians, a lot of dancers, and a lot of athletic individuals within the family structure. And so we go back to Olode, and he says, we are almost a nation of dancers, musicians, and poets. Thus, every great event, such as a triumphant return from battle or other cause of public rejoicing, is celebrated in public dances, which are accompanied with song and music suited to the occasion. This gives our dances a spirit and variety which I have scarcely seen elsewhere. So then I started thinking about, okay, well, I've recognized some dances. So here's the dance of the Botswana and the Setswana tribes. So you look at that, and I thought, that looks a lot like hip hop. So do you see the similarities?
Mm-hmm.
Then you have other things. The Setswana dance of Zimbabwe and Botswana. Started thinking about some of the things that I felt like I commonly saw in the African American community that I didn't see in other communities, and started tracing those things back for similarities. Notice here that the stepping, it's aggressive and loud stepping. The purpose of the aggressive and loud stepping is because you're communicating with the ancestors that pass on. The louder the stepping, the farther your communication can go. So then I thought about what we have in modern times called step, which is a version of stepping that is a lot more aggressive. If we keep the same tradition of the Zapata, then this is probably more aggressive because now they're in the Americas and there's a lot longer distance to communicate because they would have still felt that their ancestors were back on the coast of West Africa. And so that's how you bring together and you really bring the ancestors in more than a fraction alive. And so when you read the book, you come across with connection. I think they become closer to you as far as history becomes today, because they're presented in a way that it's presented in a way where I had realized that their descendants today are really them. We say that theoretically and philosophically, but it really is the case. And so when you read the book, it really is to display those connections, and that you get to know the history by staying close to the present.
Oh dear.
And that's it. So do you have any questions, comments?
Kerri, so you serve on the board right now, don't you, for
Yes.
the historic Smithfield?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How do you think that kind of museum can continue to address and tell the story of the enslaved there? I know you mentioned you've gone through and are working on that.
Yeah, so the museum is actually they've made a lot of progress, but there's a lot of progress to be made, because one of the things you have to change is the way you view and interpret the history. It's actually very hard, because I found I had the same issue with writing my book, with letting that community be the starring role of their own story. Like, it's so easy to make them supporting characters of their own story. Even as a writer, writing my own history, there would be times where I'm writing and then I would get really engrossed in the Prestons, what they did, what they thought, what they said. And then I would have to back it up and say, no, there's the supporting characters, stick with the main characters. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that we're working with Smithfield, is about how to interpret that in a way that's authentic to the goal of history. Because in history, as historians and as a museum, they really should display anything that they have enough documentation to say that, as far as we know, that it's the truth. And when you're dealing with the enslaved community, there's not a lot of documentation, because when you go out with your friends, you talk about the meal, you talk about the good time you have with your friends. You might even talk about the ambiance of the restaurant. But the only way you're going to talk about the waiter is if it's a really great waiter. And the most that you're probably going to say is, he was a really great waiter, you know? And so, and so that's kind of what we're dealing with the enslaved community. which is why when I do these presentations, I think Smithfield and even Virginia Tech has finally opened to the idea of your documentation is the descendants. That's your documentation. So
Interesting.
What about, go ahead.
I had a question. Thank you very much for that presentation. I enjoyed that very much. My own family has documented their history in my mother's line back to 1793. And it is very important for descendants of enslaved people to document their history and go through those census records, and because unless we do that, it is very easy to sanitize history.
right.
And I think that the truth telling allows us to restore humanity, right? It's all complicated and ugly and complex.
But
right?
it's not even just ugly. Like, that's one of the things that I'm trying to get a lot of like descendants to realize. Like, they want to avoid it because, like, I don't want to talk about slavery, the whippings and all that stuff. Like, but they did some great things too. Let's not just follow the line of the brutality. Let's follow the line of in spite of, and just have something to be proud of and something to talk about. That's not to downplay the brutality of it. You definitely should and must talk about that, but that can't be the totality of it, because then you get this false sense of inferiority that you're already fighting against because of post-traumatic slave syndrome. You know what I mean? You're already fighting against that. So when you really internalize that all we were slaves, all we were brutalized, all we did was work, and just you kind of disregard. I think with my own ancestors, with the documentation showing that they did some blatant things, like when the Civil War is over, they started building their houses on the land of Virginia Tech, and basically had an attitude was like, I'm not leaving, I built this, and tried to say that. And so when I tell that story, that kind of entices people to go back to Smithfield, because they are screaming at you through history. No. It is as much ours as it is theirs. Go back and claim that history and that experience. We tried to stay. We were ran out, but we definitely tried to stay because we felt like we had worked that, we had put that effort in, we had put that blood and tears into that. And so you should be proud of that Virginia Tech is there the way Virginia Tech is proud that Virginia Tech is there, because we built the first building that is Virginia Tech. So.
And I agree, because it is about the love and the kinships and the relationships. And it's also about rebellion. I mean, the greatest slave rebellion was the Civil War.
Right.
The North won because enslaved people walked off their plantation to fight with the North.
Right.
And, were spies for the Northern Army. So I absolutely believe those stories enrich American culture and talk about resilience just as much as the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
We need to include Black people back into that early history of America, because we were a big part of it.
Exactly.
Thank you. I enjoyed that.
Thank you. And I think that what you're saying is important. It's important to spread that message. I think the first time I did a presentation like this and showed those comparison videos of like the praise break and the religious and all that stuff. And I think it was about, and I know Virginia Tech is working on diversity. I think it was about 3 or 4 African-American students in the lecture at the time. And they were very, you can tell, disinterested to be there to hear about slavery. They walked in completely disconnected. By the time they got to the 3rd video comparison and they saw their parent life and their history, they were just like front row, like, wait a minute. I didn't even realize the praise break was like from West Africa. And it's like they wanted more and more. And I'm like, okay, that's all I have for the presentation. But if you just explore some more, it's so much there, right?
Isabel?
Yeah, I want to know, I mean, it was very interesting, so I appreciate your presentation, but does DNA play any part in your research?
Yes, yes. So I did the DNA to see what areas of West Africa we trace back to. What's interesting is that Virginia Tech and the Special Collections, they have a receipt from the Prestons where they brought enslaved individuals off of a ship called the True Blue, and it came from the coast of Angola. And so when you get the feds actually have a lot of the manifests from the ship, the True Blue. And so they show that a lot of their tribal men came from the same areas that the DNA shows that I'm connected to, it has been in Togo. So other descendants have been doing the DNA test also, just to see if they get the same results. And we're all coming up with that general modern day Nigeria area, which is where a lot of the people came from, the slave trading posts off the coast of Angola. And so I think I did mine through ancestry, so other descendants are doing the same, because when you do it that way, ancestry will say, this is your possible cousin. So, you know, we have distant cousins and their DNA test will come in, and then I'll pop up on ancestry as a cousin of theirs. So they're so excited, like, we were right, you know, we are fractions. So DNA has definitely have been a large part of it, and something that we enjoy as part of the story also.
I also, Kerri, I guess had a question because, well, I do some volunteer work at Smithfield, more in the Guardian area, but I know that one of the events was the Mary Oak that had recently, unfortunately, you know, fallen and come down. Are there any cultural or stories around the Mary Oak and the but
only as much, like we were saying before, of the Prestons mentioning that the enslaved gathered around the Mary Oak. The enslaved held a celebration at the Mary Oak, but they never gave detail. So before the Mary Oak fell, we were actually planning on doing some type of, we're actually still going to do a memorial of the Mary Oak. So there's going to be something there that says it was there. We're trying to figure out what that looks like. But even before it fell, we were trying to figure out a way to honor the Mary Oak. And Virginia Tech has basically said to me, go ahead and take the lead on what that looks like. And I think what I would like to do is to have an event or celebration at the Mary Oak that will replicate what they would have done at the time. So what that means is that we'll have a little gospel and a little church, and it's going to be the way that it's done at the AME church, because that's who they were. We're going to have, you know, drumming. There are some fraction descendants who are in Roanoke who actually still do African drumming. So they're going to come and do drumming. So we're planning a lot of things, and we're going to base what do you do during those events, during those celebrations, during those religious ceremonies off of the descendants, as what do we still do for religious ceremonies? What do we still do for celebrations? You know, who still does music? Who still does dance? And so there's a lot of that still going on, and we're going to bring all that back together and do one last replication of a celebration under the Mary Tree.
Oh, that sounds like it'll be a great event.
Yeah.
That's really
right now, mark your calendar. It'll probably be a year from now, end of September 2021. So.
Okay. Perfect. Yes, hopefully we'll all be straight out there, more free to gather. Yes. Mm-hmm. Any other questions for Kerri?
I had one other question, comment. I think it's really so important that your family is able to connect back to the land and to the place. I think that is what has situated my family history, that there is a physical place that we can go to, see, feel, touch, and connect to our ancestry. And I noticed in your presentation, you said you bring descendants back to Virginia Tech. Has that been an important part of the journey for them?
It really has. It's interesting with every group we bring back. My son is 15 now. But every group we bring back, there's someone who recognizes the married tree of the space before we point it out. There's always someone who breaks down or starts crying or has like a spiritual movement at that space. So my son and I have this thing where we try to figure out of that group who's going to be the breakdown, and we never get it right because it's always the most random individual. But I think that's very important. But what I also think is that something that wasn't intended that it looks like God gave is the title of the book is More Than a Fraction. And so because things have kind of shot off, we have an organization called More Than a Fraction and a nonprofit called More Than a Fraction. And what that has come to mean is that it's not just about the fractions. We're talking about now the enslaved community as a whole. We just have to use the fractions because they're well documented and because we can kind of use them to tell a story. But within that, one thing that we've agreed on with the family is that when people are able to trace themselves to that region, whether it be the Wake Forest community, I don't know if you guys are familiar with them, they were enslaved by the Prestons who had Kentland. We refer to everyone as cousin because we don't know. There's marriages, there's babies and everything. So everyone is a fraction. Heather, you're a fraction, everyone is a fraction, you know what I mean? Because it's more than just us. And so we just want people to be open to that idea and come and claim, you know, that experience and that history, and that it's not just about something to be, you know, shunned away from because of slavery, but it's also something to be proud of because there's a lot of, you know, doing things in spite of it and thriving despite of it, you know, and telling those stories.
Kerri, I just want to thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this, and I imagine it's been a long struggle trying to get all this information that you're doing, and I can appreciate all the effort you've gone into for this. And
thank you. I appreciate
so much for telling us about it.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yes, again, thanks for your time. I would encourage everybody. I think I'm going to go ahead and get your book, and it sounds like I'm curious to read that and see, based on your discussion tonight, how those characters, you know, not the characters, but real life, you created that story around.
You see, I struggle with that too. I'm always almost calling them characters, but they're not characters. But you know, within the book, I put little footnotes so you can know when something is like directly from a historical document, even a sentence that they actually say. And so I think it's, I know I'm an academic, but it's not written as an academic. It's written like it's a novel. It's written like you are watching a movie. So if that's the type of thing that you're interested in, and just get to know them, you know, just small things are from the descendants. There are times where when they're nervous, I have them chew their bottom lips because a lot of the fraction descendants, we seem to have full lips. And as getting to know everyone, we get nervous and we start chewing on our lips. So I make the ancestors do the same thing, you know, so, you know, it's things there that you can really enjoy.
No, I look forward to reading it. And again, thank you so much for sharing your experience in pulling together and documenting the information. And, you know, I look forward to seeing what More Than a Fraction, your foundation, and what comes out of that continued research that can help Smithfield as well continue to tell the story of the fractions besides the Prestons. So wish you the best of luck with that, and thank you for letting us recording as well, because I'm sure there are a number of other members who couldn't be here tonight that will benefit from the discussion tonight in your presentation.
Thank you. And there's one question from Mary Walters about how long the research took. The research up to the book took about 3 years, but the research is still going. So we're trying to figure out what happened to them once they was basically exiled to Salem. And so, you know, it's a continuation of that story. And we know there's a story there because the newspaper in Salem, when Thomas Fraction dies, they announce his death in the white newspaper and says a well-known Negro named Thomas Fraction died today. So we're trying to figure out, one, what did he do to be named in the white newspaper Indentured, what in the world was he well known for? And so it's like there's another story there, and we'll figure that out.
Forward to hearing and learning about that as you continue to gather information. So thanks again, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Lisa, thank you.
Good.
Thanks, Kerri.
Thanks for bringing it together for us.
No,
You're
no
welcome.
worries. Glad to do it.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Very excellent presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Have a good evening, everybody.
You too.